Okay, well, Richard, I will go ahead and push the button for this to be live after this. So everything after this point should be live.
All right. Hello, I'm Richard Nobles, and I serve as chair of the Licensed Psychology Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. And I asked the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and by other electronic medium. Linda Heisman Powell.
Here, present.
David Stevens.
Here.
Abby Callis. Mark Goodman. Matthew Golker.
Present.
Jessica Hamilton.
Present.
Edward Hunter. Tiffany Johnson.
Here.
Sarah Kirk.
Here.
Rodney McNeil. Jay Middleton.
Here.
And Richard, by the way, Rodney McNeil just entered, so he is here, although he didn't have an audible response. So.
Here.
All right, I note the presence of Rodney and Doug Wright. I also note the following staff members are also present: David Fye and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting to ensure sufficient time to handle all items on the agenda. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On August 30th, 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meeting. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may contact the board office by sending an email to bsrb@ks.gov. And as we are conducting this meeting after hours, that will be primarily for documentation and future improvement purposes. Recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the conference call, but I will let you know if I hear someone beep in. And Richard, you're currently.
Thank you, David. This meeting is now called to order, and the advisory committee will begin its discussion of the first item on the agenda, and that is to approve the agenda. Do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll move.
I'll move. Oh, go ahead.
I'll second.
Who moved? I didn't get it clear.
Linda.
All right, and the second?
I'll second.
All right, Tiffany
Thanks,
second.
Tiffany.
All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
All those opposed, same sign.
Aye.
The motion passes. Second or third on the agenda, we have a presenter here this evening. We would like for him to go first so that we can talk about a few other things later on. We have Joseph Steinmetz, excuse me, I apologize, from PCSAS, the Psychological Science Accreditation System, to talk to us about accreditation from PCSAS. A number of programs from across the country have have been moving to get accredited by PCSAS, in addition to accreditation from the American Psychological Association. And Mr. Steinmetz has agreed to come to talk to us a bit about this accreditation system. So Mr. Steinmetz, please take it away. Thank you for coming to join us.
Oh, my pleasure, and many thanks for the invitation. I have a slide deck I can attempt to share. It's only 6 slides or so. And then it's available, of course, after the meeting. So let me see if this will work okay. So far, so good.
Yes, we
Yeah.
can see your slides.
Okay, everybody can see that?
Yes.
Yes.
So again, thank you very much. So first of all, what is PCSAS? It's the Psychological Clinical Science Accreditation System, and we are an independent 501c3 that operates in the accreditation world. The real purpose of PCSAS, I would boil down to twofold. One is to provide a rigorous and objective and really an empirical-based accreditation for clinical psychology PhD programs that adhere to a particular model of training, that being a clinical science training model. And I'll say a few words more about that in just a few minutes or so. The clinical science model supports and really is there to expand the scientific foundation of behavioral health care and mental health care. I think that's one of its functions, but also it's pledged to increase the quality and quantity of clinical psychologists and clinical sciences that are contributing to a lot of aspects of public health, including public mental health. A little history of the organization. It really came out of a summit that was held over 30 years now in 1992 on the future of accreditation. And that summit was attended by about 140 leading clinical psychologists and directors of clinical training and department chairs. And that summit was sponsored by the Association for Psychological Science, by NIMH, as well as the Council of Graduate Departments of Psychology. I think what came out of that mainly after a 3-day discussion of the status of accreditation in clinical psychology was a consensus that there was needed reform of the then sole accreditation system in psychology that, of course, is based in APA. And that was established just after World War II. So it's been in existence for many, many years. There was a period of time when there were efforts within the group that came out of the summit to achieve some reforms within the prevailing accreditation system, but those were not successful. And so the specifics of what PCSAS is now began to emerge around 1995. It was formally established as an entity, an independent entity, in 2007 by what is known as the Academy of Psychological Clinical Science. And interestingly, the Academy was birthed at that same summit in 1992. The Academy is a collection of 80 programs that adhere to clinical science models of training, and includes a few internship programs as well. And so both the Academy as well as PCSAS came out of that summit. Once established, PCSAS sought to gain national recognition as a formal accreditor, and that was obtained in 2012 from the Council of Higher Education Accreditation, or CHIA. And then we went through a re-review just a year ago, and recognition was reaffirmed for another term of 7 years on May of 2022. So we have been re-upped, if you will, for another 7-year period. I became the third executive director of PCSAS in November of 2021, almost 2 years ago. That followed Richard McFall, who is a leading clinical psychologist and clinical scientist. And he was followed by Alan Kraut, and some may recognize Alan as the long-term associate or executive director of the Association for Psychological Science. And so Alan, when he retired from APS, took the position. My background is I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm actually a neuroscientist. I spent the bulk of my career at Indiana University, and I chaired the psychology department there for 9 years, and saw that department go through changes as it related to the clinical training of clinical students. I left Indiana for 15 years and had a variety of administrative positions, including I was Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Kansas from 2006 to 2009. So I feel I know the state a bit. I went to Ohio State and was the provost there, and I retired a couple of years ago as chancellor of the University of Arkansas after being there for 5 years. I was on the original PCSAS board of directors when it was formed around 2010, and also was served a 5-year term as a trustee of the Higher Learning Commission. So I'm familiar with the accreditation world quite a bit. Next, what programs are accredited by PCSAS? It's actually a growing number of programs. Since its inception, it now accredits 46 programs in the United States and Canada. There's one, McGill University is the only Canadian university. Those 46 programs are distributed in 26 different states across the country. And then we have several other programs in various stages of application, including 5 that are in the application process right now. A big change has been that 3 programs, the University of California, Berkeley, Washington University in St. Louis, as well as Stony Brook University, have all begun admitting students as PCSAS only programs and intend to drop their APA accreditation when their current terms of accreditation are up. Also note that we have one other program, the Ohio State University Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Program, that is solely accredited by PCSAS also. Another 18 of our programs out of the remaining programs have indicated possibility of going to PCSAS only accreditation in the future as well, and have indicated so publicly on their websites and other things. In other resources. PCSAS programs are among the most highly regarded in the field among clinical psychology programs. All 20 programs listed in the top 20 of the US News and World Report are PCSAS accredited. Currently, and I haven't checked the latest numbers, but the last time I looked, 42 programs are in the top 50. Of clinical psychology programs, and all are ranked highly by the National Academy of Sciences and their rankings as well. And I might add that the students do well. They have high rates of passing licensure exams at a rate of 97% for PCSAS graduates over the last decade or so. They also have great success in the match program by APIC, which allows PCSAS students into the match system, with also a 97% first match rate. And that's very recently data. And of course, given the nature of what the students that we're training, we also expect that they have during their training period publication records as well that are good. Here's a list of the schools. They are the leading schools. Every schools like Ivy League schools to large state universities from across the country. This is the complete list of the current accredited PCSAS schools. And so who recognizes PCSAS accreditation? So several government agencies do. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs was one of the first. That's a very large organization, as I think you know. Also, the Commission Corps of the U.S. Public Health Services, these all officially have recognized PCSAS. The HRSA within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services recognizes, the National Institutes of Health do. I mentioned APIC, were recognized as part of the match system for internships for students as well. And then currently we're recognized in the licensing laws or regulations of states that represent about 50% of the US population. It is a list of 13 states that formally recognize PCSAS now, including large states like California, Texas, and New York. Pennsylvania and Virginia are recent additions, and several of the other states as well. But the population mass that's represented by those states that formally recognize PCSAS for licensure is about 50% of the US population. And then the last slide, I just wanted to get to the heart of what distinguishes PCSAS accreditation and what the mission really is. We accredit doctoral training programs that grant PhD degrees in clinical psychology. And again, the core focus is on the specialty of the psychological clinical science. To be a clinical science program, programs must subscribe to an empirical, epistemological, and scientific model. And really the belief of the clinical science model is that training students in the science of clinical psychology as it applies to research, but also as that information is disseminated and used in clinical practice is of most importance. So it's really the integration of that scientific research approach during the students' training with very rigorous training and clinical aspects as well. And so both of those have to be demonstrated in the programs. That integration, I think, is the key aspect of what we're trying to accomplish as clinical science creditor and what the programs are all about. The emphasis on the reviews itself are on outcomes instead of inputs. And what I mean by that is what's central in the review process when a new program is added, or when programs are up for re-review. And since we're past our 10-year cycle, we have several programs that are coming through the second time now. And so instead of looking solely at the coursework and GRE scores, which, by the way, are not used by most of our programs. And I mean, the far majority of our programs no longer use GRE scores for their admission. But instead of using those inputs, they focus on the outcomes. And what are those outcomes? It's success at licensure, it's success in practice, it's success for some in research, it's success in integrating as graduates of these programs, the practice with research. There's a myth, I think, about PCSAS schools that the graduates don't practice, but they do. I believe the latest number of PCSAS graduates that are licensed is about 75%. So it's a large percentage. The number one output that's looked at is when we review a program, they're asked to summarize what each of their graduates in the last 10 years are doing and whether they're operating as clinical scientists or not. And as defined in many, many different ways. It could be that they're researchers at a university. It could be they're running clinics. It could be they're administrators in hospitals. But the key thing is, are they collecting data and or are they disseminating that data and knowledge that's been collected in the clinical field? It's not necessary to do both, but you have to do one of the two to operate as a clinical scientist. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is that to achieve this, there's a flexibility in the curriculum that really helps our programs achieve their clinical science outcomes. And by that, I mean the students often are encouraged in these programs to add other disciplines to their and make sure that that's being integrated into the training. Things like data science or cognitive science and neuroscience, things that I think the belief is that will produce better practitioners and better scientists when all is said and done. But I have to emphasize that there are core clinical and research competencies that must be demonstrated as you would expect to gain that accreditation. So even though there's the flexibility, there is expectations that the basics that are covered in clinical psychology programs are covered in our PCSAS schools as well. So that's the presentation I have, and I'm very happy to answer any other questions you have.
I did have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Hi, yes. I apologize. I joined 15 minutes late because of my terrible computer skills, but I finally got on. What percentage of the programs right now with the PCSAS are actually, out of all the APA approved accredited programs in clinical psychology, what percentage roughly are approved or with this psychological clinical science accreditation thing, approximately?
So are you asking for the success rate of approval or percentage of overall clinical programs there are?
Actually, both, if it's possible,
Yeah.
approximately, if you have that information.
The only information I have is my understanding is APA accredits about 400 programs, and we accredit 46. So
Okay.
you can roughly, it's 10, 11, 12% of the total programs that there are in the country. And of the other number, we have 100% success rate at accreditation, mainly because we, on the early stages of looking at whether a school will qualify for accreditation, we do a pretty good job going in of making that assessment and working with the individual programs before they make the application process. And again, because of the stature of the programs, it would be expected, since they're APA accredited as well, that they would be successful with our accreditation.
I appreciate that. I went to Brigham Young University. That's where I got my degree, and I didn't see them on the list yet. I'm hoping that'll happen down the road, obviously.
Well, we hope so too.
Yeah, thank you for that
You're
information.
And I had a couple questions as well. So I do appreciate you coming and presenting this information. I know that we have some members of the committee that are relatively new to serving on the advisory committee. And so I thought maybe I would shape or frame this question by saying that one of the reasons I think it's helpful for you to present this information is because from the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board perspective, we are one of the states that allows for different paths to licensure. And so when we have applicants apply for licensure currently, there are individuals who, if they come from an APA accredited program, we are able to move those individuals through the licensure process more quickly. And if we have individuals who apply for licensure that are not from an APA accredited program, we do have some rules in place that we can do an educational equivalency review. But I understand that there are a number of other states that not only recognize APA for licensing purposes, they also recognize PCSAS for licensing purposes. And so you may have covered this during your presentation, but Could you comment a little bit on the states that currently recognize PC SAS in terms of satisfying some of the licensure requirements for licensure?
Yes, a great question. And when I first took the position, I had a study done actually to go back and look at what the requirements in all 50 states actually was for licensing. So it took quite a while because it's a patchwork of rules, as you know, from state to state. And there's roughly 3 categories. One category are states that specifically call out APA or CO or Canadian licensure and call out that those graduates have to be accredited from one of those 2 places. There's a whole lot of states that have no language whatsoever. It turns out about the accreditation. Some say you have to have graduated from an accredited university through one of the regional accreditors. And then there are some that have called out PC SAS specifically. And I can use 2 of the more recent additions, which are rule changes have been made and voted through in both Pennsylvania and Virginia just within the last year. Both of these states had, I think, are very similar rules to what Kansas has, in the sense that there is a pathway. And I might add, almost every state has an alternative pathway through examination of records and that sort of thing. But in both the cases of Virginia and Pennsylvania, they called out APA. And both of the regulatory boards made the change to add PC SAS in the language along with APA and with the Canadian accreditation as well. So I think those are the kinds of states that are parallel. And then I would say out of the 13 states that explicitly recognize PC SAS at this point, perhaps half of them had to change their rules to do that. The other half didn't have to change the rules because they didn't have anything that specifically excluded PC SAS accredited students. So I think that's a summary of where we're at with the parity efforts across the state. And I'll also point out we have 2 other states that are just beginning the process of changing their rules.
Yeah, I would imagine some states specifically call out a national accrediting body in the language of their regulations. Others say, did you come from a program that is recognized by the board as having satisfied X, Y, Z? So, and then my second question I had was, and I'm not sure if you have any data on this, but I'm curious if it exists. Do you have any information as far as performance on the EPPP from graduates of programs that are accredited by PC SAS?
Yeah, I think that's what I was referring to before about the high pass rate in the high 90s. We had a study. These data are a couple of years old, but I believe the national average was something like 80%. When in the data set that we were looking at that particular time, the PC SAS numbers were in the upper 90s, around 97%. And it refers to that test, I believe specifically.
I have a question, if I may. So with respect to the measurement of outcomes that you were mentioning in near the end of your presentation, I think I heard you say that the way in which accreditation or reaccreditation is done is that the graduates of the program, the DCTs or the area chairs of those programs are contacted and they are asked what their graduates are doing. And if their graduates, their graduates have to be engaged in some sort of research or collection of data. and publishing or disseminating that data in some way. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, so just to say a few words about the review process. It follows the normal procedure where there are site visits and then two other reviewers that do an analysis of the whole program that has to do a self-study, et cetera. One of the features of that is an examination of the outcome data from the graduates of the program for a 10-year period, and that happens to be the accreditation period. So if you're a school that's coming in, you would perform your self-study, which has all of the information you'd expect about faculty, student performance, and all of the things that are measured. But among those, the program is asked, take a look at your graduates and rate each of the graduates whether they're functioning as a clinical scientist. And the definition of clinical scientist is they either have to be actively involved in collecting data, or they must be involved in the dissemination process of that data. Doesn't have to be both, it has to be one of the other. And so dissemination is fairly broadly described. It would include clinical practice, but it would also include things like supervision, administration, and other things like that. It turns out that the reviewers really have a hard and fast rule. There has to be at least 50% of the students in that program that are demonstrating that that outcome before they can be reaccredited or accredited for the first time.
Okay. Thank you. No, that answers my question.
I have a question. Are counseling PhD programs eligible for accreditation?
Not from PCSAS, because our language for accrediting from CHIA restricts us to PhD programs in clinical psychology.
Okay, even if they follow the I guess, scientific clinical practitioner model or whatever terminology we want to use. It's it's the label. It's the label of clinical versus counseling.
Yeah, interestingly, I'm heading next week to a school who has a counseling program that wants to get PCSAS accreditation by creating a clinical science program.
Yeah.
So you can see that they may be operating two programs or two tracks or whatever, one that's clinical science and one that is their counseling program. I think it's a little more than just the label. I think if it was a labeled program that was actually operating as clinical psychology, clinical science, we'd have a discussion with them about it.
Fair enough. Thank you.
I did have another question.
I'm sorry, Mark, can I ask a question real quick? I don't know how much time we have.
Go ahead, go ahead. Sure.
Thank you. I was just wondering, Dr. Steinmetz, on that data that you talked about, you said PCSAS compared to non-PCSAS. What's in the soup there? Is that
everybody
PhD programs only?
No, the soup, the 80% that I cited, that includes all test takers, including PCSAS students.
Yeah, because there's some major differences between clinical PhD programs and other programs when you look at EPPP scores. So I just didn't know if you demarcated that.
Yeah, I'm just really not familiar enough with that outcome in those scores to actually answer that.
Thank you. The other question I had is if we compare, a clinical PhD program that purports to do all of the things that are described in your slides, like the programs that Dr. McNeil and I came from, what's been the difference? Why is that clinical PhD program that states we all do those things and are trained in those competencies? How are they different than this PCSAS accreditation?
I think they just haven't applied for PCSAS accreditation. So if you think back about the 46 programs, they all were not PCSAS accredited, and we really didn't start accrediting until 2012 or so. And so over the last 11 years or so, those 46 schools have added. They all had the outcomes that we were looking for, you know, and then could apply and then were granted PCSAS accreditation. We just introduced a new, because we were approached by 4 or 5 programs that are brand new, just starting out. They have no outcomes whatsoever. So we have created a pathway which has some provisional accreditation steps in it for those brand new programs as well. But I think the short answer is those are programs we wish would apply because including the University of Kansas, which I know the program really quite well. I think those are the kinds of programs that would qualify for PCSAS accreditation easily.
Thank you.
May I go ahead with my quick question? Yeah, I was going to ask, is there a certain number of credit hours that you have to have with the PCSAS accreditation?
Yeah, I think we use the guidelines that are present in most of the universities. So we don't have, you have to have 3 in this and 3 in this and 3 in this and 3 in this, and that has to total some number. That's when I was talking about the flexibility of the curriculum itself. And if I look at the 46 programs, they have lots of different ways of getting to that, to the competencies that we're actually looking for. So I think instead of worrying about the exact number of credit hours, I think PCSAS is more interested in is the competency and the training that goes on for each of the students. And that includes internships, because we do require internship for PCSAS programs as well.
I appreciate that. Thanks for answering that.
Any further questions for Dr. Steinmetz? Dr. Steinmetz, thank you so much for visiting with us this evening. We really very much appreciate it. And if we have any other questions, we will surely forward them back to you.
Yeah, please do. And again, I can send this presentation out as well if you don't have it already.
Please do. You can send it to David and he could forward it out to us.
Okay, will do. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard, before we move to the next item, I just wanted to let you know that Abby Callis and Mark Goodman had logged into the meeting, so they are present as well.
Yes, I have seen them both. Thank you. I was going to make a similar remark. I'll move us on to the next item, and that is the review and the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. Are there any addenda to make or any revisions to make to the agenda? Excuse me, to the minutes? None being seen, I'll take a motion to approve said minutes.
Motion to approve minutes.
Jay moves. I'll take a second.
Jessica will second it.
Jessica seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All those opposed, same sign. That motion passes. I'll move us on to the executive director report. Dave.
Thank you, Richard. So I'll provide some updates in terms of the BSRB operations and some updates from the previous board meeting, and then we'll talk about a few other items of note. So one item since the last time the advisory committee has met, there was a bill that passed during the 2023 legislative session, added some additional responsibilities for the agency, also added some timeframes for certain processes. And so as part of our new responsibilities, we received authority to hire 2 more licensing specialists to help us out with the workload. And we received that. We have been in the process of trying to fill those positions. And so as of July 1st, that's when we could start looking at candidates for those 2 spots. So we were able to identify 2 new licensing specialist positions. And in part of that process, it opened up some other positions here in the agency. And so now, as of about maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we are fully staffed and everyone is in their correct positions. There are some logistical issues to work through, getting new technology for staff members, There's a limited amount of physical space here in the office, so we have some temporary workstations set up in the boardroom. So we are putting things into place figuratively and literally, but we're in a good place and moving forward. So really excited about that. Additionally, last month, on behalf of the BSRB, I submitted a budget for the agency. All state agencies are required to submit a budget by September 15th each year. And so on behalf of the BSRB, I submitted a budget. We are currently in fiscal year 2024. And we last year submitted a budget for changes to fiscal year 2023 and then a new budget for 24 and 25. This year, we submitted revised changes to fiscal year 2024 and 2025. We were able to submit a budget at the amounts that we were approved for previously. So I don't anticipate any significantly large expenditures. Part of the approved expenditures did include the funding for the 2 new positions. So even though we are going to be spending more than we traditionally have, the board is not looking at any kind of a fee increase to make up the money for those positions, at least for the next couple of years. We have a balance in the fee fund right now of about $2 million. Our budget for the year is about $1 million. And so in working with the members of the legislature and the board, it was the agreement that we would go ahead and look at revenues and expenditures for the next couple of years and then reevaluate at that time to see if we needed to take any other further adjustments to fees to make sure that we come to a good balance. Another item in terms of operations, we have continued to broadcast meetings to the BSRB YouTube channel. We started that back in January of 2021. To this point, we have broadcast or uploaded afterwards about 126 meetings, and those have been viewed roughly 4,700 times. So really proud of the outreach that we're able to make. We received a lot of questions from individuals based on the information that the board has shared in meetings and broadcasts. And then when I've had the opportunity to go and talk with individuals from other states, that's one of the items that we share as a way the board is trying to provide more accessibility to the conversations that are taking place and help more people be in on the conversations and know what's coming up in the future. In terms of some other operations, we are currently in the process of replacing some of our IT. So that is something that we'll be working on here over the next few weeks. We're getting some new laptops for certain staff members. There'll be a little bit of a transition, but it should not interrupt operations too much. Additionally, all state agencies, based on an executive order from the governor, are putting together continuity of operations plans. We have already had sort of a bare bones plan for the agency, but there are now specific guidelines. So all state agencies are putting into place a COOP or a continuity of operations plan based on some of the requirements. And we've been meeting with representatives from the Department of Emergency Management to make sure we're fulfilling that. The time frame for completing that is the end of the calendar year. So that's what we're looking at right now to put those things into place. In terms of some other items, I'll go ahead and turn to some updates from the past board meeting. The board most recently met in September, and some of the items from that board meeting, there is one new member of the board, and that is Jill Flessing. She is the board member for addiction counseling. She is taking the spot previously held by Deb Stidham. We welcomed Jill to the board. There should not be any future appointments until at least next July. Additionally, the board discussed possible changes to an existing requirement in the regulations for individuals that are submitting changes to clinical training plans. For a lot of the professions, individuals that are seeking clinical licensure have to submit an approved training plan. And the current language and regulations indicates that they would have to submit any changes within 45 days of making that change, and it would have to be reviewed and approved. And the board is looking at possible alternate methods that provide a little more flexibility to individuals in terms of submitting possible changes or making changes as an alternative to the 45-day time frame. Additionally, a couple of the professions currently allow individuals from other professions to provide clinical supervision. And there is a discussion by a few of the different advisory committees on that topic. One of the item under that conversation is the current language in the regulations calls for extenuating circumstances to be present for individuals from other professions to be supervising in certain situations. And so the board has asked the advisory committees to have a conversation on that topic, specifically for the professional counseling and marriage and family therapy professions. And then the board can receive reports back from those advisory committees to determine how to move forward to make sure we're consistent with everyone. Additionally, some of the other items the board members were made aware of, there is a recent change to federal law that has to do with the Service Members Civil Relief Act and portability of professional licenses for service members and their spouses. It's a federal bill that essentially, as best as we understand it at this time, it would allow individuals who hold a license in another state, if they are a military member or military spouse, if they come to Kansas and wish to practice in Kansas, as long as they operate under a similar scope of practice and they hold a license in good standing in their state, they would have an option to essentially have a recognition of their license as an alternative to applying for traditional licensure in Kansas. We're still working with this, working through this with legal counsel for the board. Currently, our processes to practice in Kansas would require someone to be licensed or practicing under, let's say, 5-pack authority of the multi-state compact. So this is something new. We're still working through the details, but we'll probably have an announcement on the website here in the next month or so. The board is also looking at drafting language on an expedited application review process. That was one of the items that was put forward in the bill that passed this past year, Senate Bill 131. Some of that the board has had good conversation on, and I think the board will be looking at language to submit to the regulatory process sometime here in the next month or so. Also, the board was supportive of putting out an RFP for impaired provider programs. Some other state agencies here in Kansas and some in other states utilize a program. Some states have a robust program with significant funding that would allow licensees to seek treatment if they are suffering from an issue involving substance use or mental health issues. Other states have a program that is more tailored to be a disciplinary remedy in situations where there's been a complaint, but you find a co-occurring issue involving substance use or mental health issues, where the board would be able to use that type of a system for tracking purposes or to assist as an alternative to traditional remedies the board would have available. So we'll be putting out an RFP sometime in the future, looking at who can provide services the board may wish to seek and some of the terms that those groups could provide. Additionally, there is currently some language for some of the professions for those individuals who are seeking clinical licensure. For every 15 hours of direct client contact, there is a requirement of 1 hour of supervision. And the board is going to be picking up a conversation on that here in the future. And then also, there was previously a requirement for a lot of the professions to become a clinical level practitioner. You needed to have 4,000 hours providing services, and the minimum time period for that was 2 years. That 4,000 hours was decreased recently to 3,000 hours, but no change was made to the 2-year minimum requirement. And the board has had discussions recently on if that 2 years should be dropped to 18 months to keep the same ratio. There are some interesting things in play here. There is some recent changes in terms of Medicare reimbursement, and that is not a topic that the BSRB has a great deal of involvement in. Most of the reimbursements are handled by larger agencies like the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, KDHE, or the Department for Aging and Disability Services, KDAD. However, in reviewing some of the language for those changes in Medicare, specifically as it involved marriage and family therapy and professional counseling, there is a description of types of individuals that may qualify under those services. And one of the items listed is having spent 2 years providing services. So we're looking into possible issues if that time frame is shortened from 2 years to 18 months. If there's technical issues involved, I've reached out on behalf of the BSRB to KDHE for clarification. They are studying that and they will give me an update. They've notified me sometime in the future. So in turning to a few more updates, I mentioned the bill that passed, Senate Bill 131. You have probably received a message from me on behalf of the BSRB prior to July 1st, where the agency was able to roll out a significant number of items in that bill as of that date. And then I believe mid-August, we were able to roll out the additional items. This has been quite an undertaking by the agency. Many of these don't exist in any other state. Some of these were very innovative approaches, I believe, by the board. And behind the scenes, my staff was able to do a lot of work on forms, working with our vendor for our licensing system to make sure we could actually issue those license types. We went before a committee to put in temporary regulations to be able to issue some of those license types as quickly as possible. We are also going through the process of having those regulations made permanent. And so there's a lot of moving pieces right now, but there are announcements on the front page of the BSRB website about a lot of those different license types. So if you do have questions, I would recommend visiting our website, and you can see a lot more information on those new types of licenses that were issued. In terms of some items that are coming up here in the very near future, there are two meetings next week that I wanted to reference. We are putting together an informational forum for different groups of individuals. And this is something we have not done in many, many years. But the BSRB is going to be hosting an informational forum on Tuesday, October 17th. And that will be specifically for educators from universities and colleges in Kansas that have programs for professionals licensed by the BSRB. And many years ago, the BSRB had an educator forum. From what I have heard, those were in person, but we're trying to take a broader approach and reach out to individuals and trying to get as many people connected with some of our updates and information, and just share some of the work by the board, some of the changes that have recently been put into law, and then also some of the proposed changes that the board will be looking at in terms of regulatory changes moving forward. So as a way to be proactive and get some of the message out, we're holding an informational forum for 1 hour on Tuesday, October 17th for educators. And then the following day on Wednesday, October 18th, we also have an educational forum by Zoom, and that will be for individuals that are representatives of employers. So we have one forum set up for the educators, and then the next day for entities and organizations that employ a lot of the professionals that are licensed by the BSRB. So currently trying to build a good contact list for both groups. Like I said previously, many years ago, the BSRB had an educator forum, but it's been many years since that happened. So I've been working with my staff and trying to reach out to the different programs around the state. And for the employers, we've never, to my knowledge, done an event like that. So, but I'm really excited about that. Really excited to connect with more individuals and help to clear up any kind of confusion, and just, share a lot of the work the board is doing. I'm really proud of the board members and a lot of the time that they're putting in, making really positive changes, modernizing the rules, the statutes. So happy to share that information. So those both are going to take place next week. And then the following week, on Monday, October 23rd, the board will be hosting an out-of-town planning meeting. It's an all-day meeting. The board generally tries to have an all-day meeting once a year to kind of go through items for its legislative agenda, work on items that would require in-depth discussion. And so we'll be collecting the feedback from those forums as part of what we share with the board members, and then the board will be taking up some other topics as well. That all-day board meeting will be in Wichita, and we'll have some information posted on the BSRB website about the specific location, but we've discussed that a couple times, the board meetings, and looking forward to having all the board members together to work on some of those other issues. With that, I think I will go ahead and end my report and stand for any questions.
Any questions for Dave? I do want to take a moment of personal privilege to thank you and your staff for the work that you have done to implement the changes needed to get the regulatory and statutory changes up and running from that were initiated and instigated last year or last legislative session. I know that it took a lot of work to get to get those changes enacted. So I'm very grateful for the work you and everyone at the BSRB undertook to get the work done.
Thank you, Richard. I appreciate those comments. And Leslie Allen, the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager, is here. She did a tremendous amount of work meeting with lots of different people behind the scenes. There's tons of changes to existing forms, new forms. The staff was pushed by me and other people, hard to make sure that we got those things in place, but they really responded, and I'm really proud of the work that they all did. So I appreciate those kind words, and yeah, Leslie, definitely a big kudos to you. I agree with Richard, and really proud of the work that our staff did. And a lot of that too is coming down, and we've had a few staff meetings to make sure the staff members can answer questions, because we knew when we posted that information, we were going to be getting a lot of people calling the office with questions, and I think they've done a wonderful job responding to those items. So thank you for that.
You're more than welcome. Any other comments or questions about the Executive Director's report? None seen. I'll move on to the next item on our agenda, and that's updates from the ASPPB meeting from 2 weeks ago almost, I think. And I'll kick us off. So David and Linda and I went to Cleveland for the annual meeting of the ASPPB, and I would say that it was a good time had by all. We had a number of, I think, vibrant and informative discussions about a number of topics. I wrote a few things down, and David and Linda, please do chime in. I know that David has a number of remarks that he will make, and Linda, please, if you have anything that you would add to what I'm about to kind of talk about, I would more than happily hear, your perspective on things. There were 7 sessions in total that were held at the meeting, one of which I missed because it was on Sunday and I flew out that morning. And I will also say there was one session where I was a bit confused as to what was going on, and I'll have David talk a bit about that. But one session was purely devoted to how different jurisdictions handle different problems. And we had a really good and long discussion about how we might compare to different states and provinces as to how we handle discipline. And I think there was a lot of food for thought about what we can do here in the state of Kansas when it comes to the discipline that we administer and the regulations that we can implement around certain actions in which our licensees might engage. There was another session that had to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and it was specifically related to registration. And we talked about implicit bias in our registration process. So essentially, are we doing things in the registration process that might evoke implicit bias? We focused on physical disability and the language that we might use to ask about things that might be going on for our licensees. And are there ways in which we might be able to reduce the possibility of invoking or kind of eliciting implicit bias in asking questions? And I think that was a really fruitful discussion. We looked at our own application, our initial application for licensees and our renewal application. And there are some things that I think that we can look at when it comes to whether or not we are asking about things that could bias our evaluation process of our licensees. We also talked a bit about the different legislation that's coming out of the states and out of the provinces. And there are definitely things going on around the country that, for better or for worse, that are kind of getting at this matter of deregulation and how deregulation affects our ability to license prospective licensees. And there were a number of discussions of what it is that we might need to do to prevent this this kind of onslaught in some ways of legislation that's kind of coming through the different state legislatures around deregulation. I had a particularly good conversation with someone about how multiple state legislatures have put through bills that are targeting licensing boards and the attempts to deregulate us essentially. And I can talk more about that. We also talked about licensing master's level, and this was a little bit tricky, talking about licensing master's level practitioners and how we would want to talk about those practitioners. In Kansas, we already license master's level practitioners, but a lot of other states don't. In fact, Kansas is kind of in the minority. I think only like 17 states and provinces do that, whereas 50 others do not. And ASPPB has a task force that's devoted to this matter of figuring out what is the scope of practice for for master's level practitioners, what would be the title for them, the scope of practice, and what are the ways in which they can be delineated from psychologists that are on the doctoral level. And lastly, from what I was able to kind of get through, we talked a bit about continuing education versus what would be termed as continuing professional development, and how a lot of states are moving towards a model of continuing professional development, which would include skills, which would include engaging in activities that have more to do with increasing competency and maintaining competency across one's professional life, as opposed to just taking classes and racking up hours in maybe specific classes, looking at things like publications, looking at things like engaging in teaching or supervision, or being on a board such as this as part of the professional development endeavor. So those are some things that were talked about. We talked about a whole number of things at the conference. It was really enjoyable and it was really informative. And that's kind of a 30,000-foot view of what we discussed. I can take questions, and of course, David and Linda, if I missed things, I know that I missed one thing, and that was the sixth one, and that had to do with the governance of ASPPB, and that was just over my head because this was my first meeting. So any questions about what it is that happened at the conference, or David and Linda, you can add to what it is that was discussed.
Yeah, and I'll defer to Linda first, and then I'll add a couple comments. But Linda, do you have anything you want to share about your time at the conference?
Yeah, I do want to echo Richard, and it was very, very enjoyable. The one thing that struck me, and it's not that it's a competition or anything, but I think Kansas is at the forefront of policy and practice and engagement, and as members of the board, and it was just it's very professionally validating to see where the kind of work that David and Leslie and Richard and all the leadership brings to making sure that we're moving our agenda forward and helping to ensure the safety of the public, that we seem to be a step up. So I was very, very pleased with that. So that's about the only thing I have to say. It was nice. It was a good meeting.
Well, thank you, Linda. And Yeah, this conference is a really good conference. It's the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. And so it does involve the 50 United States, but also the Canadian provinces. And one thing that was interesting, they did a roll call to make sure that they had quorum to conduct business at this meeting. And quorum was 34, and they had 38 jurisdictions that were present. So there were a fair number of states that had no representation, no attendees, didn't have a voice, and possibly didn't really have someone to collect the information to bring back. And so I want to say a big thank you to Richard and Linda for attending this conference with me. I thought it was very beneficial for myself, but also I'm sure you both took a lot of good information from it, and us being able to have conversations there and then being able to take stuff back to work on here at the advisory committee and then at the board level as well. Really, really happy that I know how valuable everyone's time is, and really want to thank you both for volunteering your time to do that. So thank you for that. Some of the items that I picked up that I thought were particularly interesting from the conference, they talked a little bit about educational equivalency, and they are working on a task force with ASPPB to try to provide some standards for educational equivalency reviews. I think one of the issues that the advisory committee has talked about at a few meetings is the shift from APA, and it sounds like PCSAS is also this way, of moving away from courses to more equivalencies. And from a licensing perspective, that makes it challenging because when we are dealing with a volume of applicants, when we can look for courses, we can move those through differently than if we're trying to determine equivalencies. Even if we have a good process in place, the time it would take to do equivalency is going to be an issue. And so they are working on a task force to establish some standards. They are hoping to have some comments out for public comment. They said sometime a few weeks after that meeting ends. So I'll be looking here to see when those are published, but they should be open for public comment for about 60 days. So if I see them posted, I'll send them out to you if you want to send comments back to me that we could kind of think about on our state level in terms of some of their educational equivalency concepts they're looking at. Another topic that task force was looking at was remediation. And that is the idea that if there are some individuals who apply for licensure, but they're just a few courses short, the best way to handle those individuals that are almost meeting the qualifications for licensure, but not quite there. In Kansas, we do have some ways that we can help individuals out. We have a provisional license we can offer that would last for no more than a year, and people would be able to finish up some remaining courses. But remediation is a topic that I personally want to learn more about, and I would like us to continue to look at because I think having more flexibility in that area or being able to help people who are close should be a good priority that we can kind of look at in the future. There was an individual named Hao Song, I believe, and she's the director of exam services for ASPPB. She presented some information on the EPPP. I did find out that EPPP was started back in 1965. And by the mid 1980s, all 50 states and some territories were utilizing the examination. This past year, there were about 8,000 EPPPs administered or expected to be administered. And as of August 2023, for the jurisdictions that currently use the EPPP2, there were about 350. They did note that the passage rates for, they're calling it now Part 1 and Part 2, seem to be positive or moderately positively correlated, which I thought was interesting. And so, as you may recall, they had announced about a year ago that as of January 1st, 2026, anyone wishing to continue to use the EPPP would need to require both Part 1 and Part 2. And so kind of watching to see some of the information that is coming out about Part 2. In terms of some of the EPPP standards, they talked about the independent practice level for Part 1 and Part 2 being set at 500. They also talked about the supervised practice, or what we would consider the master's level psychology. They would recommend that we set at 450. Currently for our master's level psychologists, it's set at 400 for the non-clinical level. They did note that some states that do license the master's level have a lower number than the 450, some as low as 250. And so it was talked about that there was a task force looking at master's level programs and some potential standards for that. And so it'll be interesting to see. That was a group that had not finalized their recommendations yet, but we did discuss some of the items that Kansas currently utilizes for our master's level psychology program. And on behalf of our state, I did share some concerns with some of the items that they were talking about in terms of where their task force was currently at. So there are 2 sample exams for the EPPP Part 1 and 1 sample exam for the EPPP 2 that are available for both testing centers and online delivery as of spring 2023. And about half the people take advantage of the sample examinations, which I thought was kind of interesting. There was a mock disciplinary hearing that took place one day, and that was interesting to see played out. And then there were some comments from jurisdictions. I thought in terms of those items, there was one state that has a range of penalties by violation. And so they sort of have a grid in terms of what disciplinary remedy would be suitable for what types of violations. That was in Oregon and Virginia. They also had brought in a consultant to look at essentially sentencing guidelines based on awarding points for different factors when there were violations. We have started to talk about that a little bit in the Kansas, in terms of what Kansas might look at. I think one of the issues there is that, you know, on some of these disciplinary findings, if there is a violation, frequently there are more than one regulations that are violated. And so being able to split apart what the remedy was for which regulation that was violated might be particularly challenging. And if you do have someone with multiple violations, would you stack all those on top of each other? So I think there are questions to ask, but it's something that is interesting to look at from one state's perspective. There was the exercise where we looked at our applications to make sure that there was to avoid any kind of bias and to make sure that the questions we were asking, we have a legitimate reason for why we're collecting that information. And the questions we're asking are tailored to really go after that information. Richard did mention, you know, there was a question about physical disabilities that appears on the exam, the applications for a lot of different states. And for some of those states, it does not ask, you know, have you had one recently that might affect your ability to practice? It just asks, have you ever had one? And there were questions about, you know, is that really relevant to your ability to practice today and things like that. And also questions as far as any kind of mental impairment, if those happened a long time ago and people receive treatment. You know, there were a lot of good exercises by thinking through these things and being sure that we're asking the right questions. And in going through our applications, I do feel like the questions we ask, we have good reasons for why we're asking them, and they link up to the statutes and regulations. And I took home a few questions to talk to Leslie about, Leslie Allen, the assistant director, and had some good conversations about some of those items on the applications as well. And so, but pretty happy with the way that our applications are worded. But if we need to adjust those in the future, we definitely can. And then, yeah, in terms of the governance, there was a presentation from ASPPB that was sort of an internal look at the association. Some of this is before my time as well, but I believe this is an association that had membership that were, you know, critical of some of the decisions that were made or the way that certain things were handled. And this is an association that brought in an outside company to look at some of their internal processes and look at ways to make improvements in the future. And so they shared a little bit about that information, and you know, it's always a good idea to be looking at your current practices and try to be looking at how you can make improvements in the future. In terms of other items, just for the sake of time, I'll just say that there were some jurisdictional updates that I thought were particularly interesting. There were a couple of states that were having issues with licensing timeframes. One that it was taking many days for them to go through and process applications. They had a backlog, I believe, in the hundreds of applications that were ready, but they were not able to get through those. At this meeting, they announced that they were successfully down to about 100 days per application, which I still think, you know, sometimes when you only hear about one state, you don't really know how you compare to other states. But for most of our applications, they are resolved in a much shorter period of time. We do have some that are unique, where they have unique factors that take longer. But in terms of evaluating us compared to some of the other states, it's helpful to get that perspective. So with that, that's the comments that I brought from that, and got a few things that they talked about here that I think would be interesting for us to look at in the future. Things like remediation, educational equivalency, but I think those will be ongoing conversations for the future.
Any questions for any of us, or any thoughts about what we've discussed? None seen. I'll move us right along to agenda item number 7, and that is an update on the SIPAC Commission.
Yes, and so as of January 1st, 2022, Kansas became a member of a multi-state compact for licensed psychologists, referred to as SIPAC, and that is a multi-state compact that allows individuals to apply to practice under the compact authority. Most individuals that do so practice telehealth services under the compact authority. And so I have some updated numbers in your packet of material. You should see a commission newsletter from October 2023. Basically, as of October, the number of individuals that are practicing under SIPAC authority in Kansas, there are 93 individuals that are providing telehealth services under that compact authority that hold a license here in the state of Kansas, and then 8 individuals that provide a limited number of days of service in other compact states. Those numbers have somewhat flattened out over the last few months. Initially, when we became a member of the compact, they were rising pretty sharply, but I think they have somewhat leveled out. We will know more for sure when we have the next license renewal for licensed psychologists, which occurs every June of even numbered years. So we may see a change as we approach that date next calendar year. But recently, I've seen that number stay about the same. In terms of other updates on SIPAC, there were currently some rules that were out for comment. They were posted on the BSRB website. The proposed rules for the commission had to do with clarifying the understanding of the authority that SIPAC provides. For example, in other states, when someone has a license, there may be other individuals that have certain rights based on that person's license, people that could practice under their license. What they wanted to clarify was that if someone is practicing under SIPAC authority, there are no inferred rights to other people purely based on the ability to practice under SIPAC. So if you have SIPAC authority and you're practicing under that, it does not mean that other people can practice, such as interns or students, under SIPAC authority. They wanted to clarify that. So that's the language change that was up for public comment, and then that will be considered with a vote of the delegates at the annual meeting. And that commission annual meeting is going to be November 16th and 17th. So as a commissioner for Kansas for SIPAC, I'll be attending that meeting and voting on behalf of the state of Kansas on those rules. So that's the update that I have on SIPAC.
Any questions for David regarding SIPAC? Seeing none, I'll move us on to item number 8. In terms of old business, the first item that's listed is a continuation of the discussion regarding possible changes on unprofessional conduct regulations. David and I had a discussion at the ASPPB conference about how we might want to go about having this discussion. And where we left off was we left off at the point of beginning to compare what the licensed psychology section, what we don't have versus what the other professions do have in their conduct regulations or their unprofessional conduct regulations. And I thought that what we could do is have a discussion about what we may see in some of their regulations, and if we would want to add those to ours, or if we would want to make certain augmentations to ours so as to line up with some of the regulations with the other professions. David, is that a reasonable account of what we discussed?
Yes, I believe so. And for some of the members that are relatively new to the committee, just kind of to frame this is something that the advisory committees have been working on for about the last year, maybe a little bit longer, but this is something that was started in 2022. Each of the advisory committees was asked to review the unprofessional conduct regulations specific to their profession to see if there was any outdated terminology or items that are suitable to be removed, if there was anything that appeared to be missing, or if that was anything that was confusing that needed the terminology changed for better understanding. And so each of the advisory committees for each of the professions spent time reviewing. This advisory committee went item by item, discussed each item to determine if it should stay, if it should be changed. And then the recommended changes were put together, and you'll see a marked up copy in your packet. The licensed psychology regulations begin on page 13 of that document. But each of the advisory committee's proposed changes were sent to the board, and the board thought it would be helpful for each of the advisory committees to have the changes returned to them along with the proposed changes from the other professions. So that way you could compare the changes that your committee was discussing versus what maybe the Addiction Counseling Advisory Committee had discussed, or the Behavior Analyst Advisory Committee had discussed, or the Social Work Advisory Committee, to see if there was any conversations or topics they discussed that maybe were not had in this group, and you thought maybe some of the items that they recommended might be helpful to also include in yours. But in terms of the best way to approach that, if you feel you could talk about that today, we could start to have that conversation. But if it'll be a larger conversation, that could be continued to the next meeting. The hope is to have recommendations finalized by the end of this calendar year, so that way they could be sent back to the board, and then the board could decide on what type of action would need to be taken for the regulations.
Any thoughts on how we might want to proceed from anybody?
I was thinking as David was talking that I remember mostly going through that with like a fine-tooth comb. So I don't know how big the conversation will be, but I'm not sure I feel prepared to talk about if somebody else had something that I felt like we were missing, because I did not, I guess I missed the direction. I didn't go through the other disciplines in enough detail, probably. I don't know if everyone else did that. That was just me.
And that's okay. The licensed psychology set in the combined document are on pages 13 through 18. But if you need additional time, and there's certainly a lot of pages to this document. This document is 40-something pages. And so totally understandable. And these, for example, your unprofessional conduct regulations, the last time they were modified was 2004. So it has been 20 years.
Yep.
So since we're making changes, or the proposed changes would be recommended, if there needs to be a little bit more time, I think that would be suitable to take some time between now and the next meeting, and then come back ready to discuss some of those changes.
And there are, from what I have been able to go through, there are, Abby, a number of things that are not in the psychology unprofessional conduct regulations that are in other professions unprofessional conduct regulations.
Were they things you liked?
So there were a couple of things that certainly would be that I think that we would want to chew on. One example has to do with a question of, I wrote it as a question of expanding engagement and the time frame of engaging in physical or sexual intimacies from 24 months to never engaging in them, or Missouri has it at 5 years. So that is that's a topic of conversation that I think that we could have, and and probably a pretty robust conversation that we could have.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Yeah, a number of the other professions have it as never. We have it as 24 months.
Mhm.
I might have missed it. So there's red markings throughout ours. So was that, let me see, were those some of the things that we had already changed, or was this?
Yes, those were the ones
Okay.
that we had already changed.
Okay, I just wanted to be
Mhm.
clear, because I don't remember that we had a detailed convo about the social media things, but I guess we did. So
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
I didn't think it was enough for us to have, those changes made, I
As
guess
much
I
as
should
this
say.
year. Yeah.
Yeah.
A
I think I'm
couple
with
of,
I don't
Abby,
know.
like just,
I mean,
oh, go
for,
ahead.
sorry, Tiffany. For someone who teaches ethics, I've never really understood the arbitrary metric of 24 months or 2 years, because there's no evidence really that says that there's some magic to that number. So it's just never made sense to me.
Mhm. That's a fair point.
Mhm.
So I totally get what you're saying, Abby, in that we certainly could have some time to kind of read through these, see what other professions are doing, and come back to this for our December meeting and kind of go through a number of points that I think would be some pretty detailed discussions on some of these. A number of professions, as another example, a number of them have a discrimination clause, like if it would be unethical, or it would be against the regulations to engage in discrimination against clients, and here is what discrimination would entail. But the psychologists do not have such a clause in their unprofessional conduct regulations.
That's one that really jumped out to me that I'd
Yeah.
like us to
We
discuss.
need that.
Yeah.
Well, personally, I would need time to read the rest of them, and you've picked out some really key highlights already. So if you want to talk about those today, I'm comfortable with that, because you've already picked out things that I think probably will have robust conversation associated with them. So, but from my own perspective, I would need to read it again.
No, absolutely. And I think that we can table the discussion and allow time for everybody to kind of read through them, and then we can return to them in December. I think that's fair.
And one comment I'll make too, one of the reasons there might be some differences between the different sets of regulations is because there's sort of a push-pull with the different sets of regulations. Since we are a composite board that licenses 7 different professions, and some people hold multiple licenses under the BSRB, sometimes there can be an interest in having similar standards or similar things in regulation for different license types. However, each of these professions, or a lot of them, also sometimes have national associations that put out things like standards on these issues. And so sometimes there are members of those professions that say, well, what does our national association say on this level? And so there's an effort to be consistent between the professions, but then there's also that desire to be consistent with what the National Association might put out there. And as a further wrinkle, some of those national associations that put items out there don't necessarily put items out there the way that the BSRB would. These regulations are intended to establish unprofessional conduct, that if someone violated these, there would be a disciplinary remedy. So there would be a consequence if they violated these. What some associations put out is more of best practices that are aspirational. And there is a line between best practices versus what would constitute unprofessional conduct. There's probably something in the middle where maybe this is not the best preferred method, but the opposite may not necessarily be a violation. So that has created a little bit of complication in working through this and trying to figure out what really should be the items that if a practitioner did or failed to do would have a penalty versus things that maybe an association would put out to say, we would want all practitioners hopefully to be doing these things at the highest level. There's probably a difference between that versus unprofessional conduct.
Yeah, I'd like to make one other comment. I'm in a rural area and more rural than a lot of people, and a lot of times there's a chance of, you have to think about dual relationships, and you're in a small community, and you have to travel a long ways to get something fixed or whatever, or you come in contact with somebody that you've done therapy with or an evaluation, and yet they're the only ones in town that can fix your car or something like that. I see that as a potential thing that we should discuss as well, especially people like myself in more rural areas. That just crossed my mind, as I was going through this. There's a lot of different things that need to be discussed on that. I just want to share that thought with you.
No, I agree. That's the first thing that popped into my mind when they talk about aspirational versus probably real world, is that, in Pittsburgh, small, but probably not as small as where you're at. I don't know, maybe. Ideally, we avoid all dual relationships. That would be aspirational, but, real world, that's unlikely. And so just being thoughtful about those type of issues and the gray that often comes up and also makes these topics interesting.
Yes, I agree.
No, that's that's all very fair, and I think that we can have a robust discussion about about those issues, those concerns, in our next committee meeting. And I would have folks write down things that stick out to them, and we can certainly go through those things in due time next time. Any other thoughts
I
before?
have a question. So for the December meeting, looking at what the other professions have, seeing if there's anything that we want to include in ours, but taking into consideration that, for example, addiction counselors will license people that have lived experience, where in psychology, we try to refrain from hiring people that like there was one, what was it, David? It came up at at our conference, and it's like, in one of them, it was like they couldn't have had any substance use within 24 months, but in addiction counseling, it was 12 months clean and sober or something like that. So there's like some tension there as well across professions.
Yeah, and there's also some cultural issues within professions, and or organizational things that arise. I work with a lot of substance use folks, and due to various organizational structures that they work with, from at least what they tell me, not necessarily what I work in, they have a lot more paperwork they have to do. I don't know how else to put it. And so that's reflected if you look at a lot of their changes in their code. A lot of their highlighted red was adding a bunch of paperwork stuff in terms of what they needed, which may or may not apply to psychologists depending on the agency you work at or where you're at. And so some of this may be a function of just other things that are bigger than us, or just other kind of side items.
No, both of those points are very true, I think, especially when it comes to the matter of sort of cultural matters within a profession, and keeping in mind what the APA Code of Ethics says and the associated codes and guidelines. So like the psychometric guidelines, as an example, like keeping those things in mind as we look at the regulations when we go to look at these in December. I think that that's absolutely apt and right, Linda, because there will be things that we may see in, say, social work as an example. Not to say anything about social work, but there may be things that we might see in social work that might be compelling for social work, but may not be as compelling for licensed psychology because there may be organizational or cultural differences just in terms of how the profession how a profession carries itself out. So yes, I totally agree with that. Any other thoughts regarding this? I think this will be a really good discussion as we carry it through. Seeing none, I'll go on to 8B, and that is a discussion on the CPQ. David, I'll have you take it from here.
Okay. So we introduced this topic at the last meeting. We talked a little bit about the annual conference for the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards. And one of the items that came up recently was that ASPPB does have a program called CPQ. And a CPQ is something that is offered that is not required, but a lot of jurisdictions have adopted the Certificate of Professional Qualification in Psychology as a way to shorten the licensure process if individuals have attained this CPQ and they can get special recognition so that when they are applying for licensure in other jurisdictions that recognize the CPQ, it's a quicker process. And in your material, I included a document kind of explaining the CPQ program information, some of the benefits there. And then there's a second document that basically has a list, and there are 43 jurisdictions that currently accept the CPQ. 11 others recognize it as far as waiving one of the licensure requirements for applicants, and then 2 others are in the process of recognizing it. And this, to my knowledge, is not something that has come before Kansas in the past, and I don't have a great deal of familiarity with it. But at the last meeting, I asked if members of the advisory committee could review this information and maybe do a little bit of research, look into it a little bit more to see if you thought it would be something that would be helpful for Kansas, specifically the board, to look at possibly trying to move forward and becoming one of the jurisdictions that accepts CPQs, or if you had any other thoughts or comments after having a chance to look at the materials a little bit more.
I, for one, am 100% in favor of it. I mean, CPQ is really pretty much been accepted by most states, and all of our graduates get CPQ. It's the easiest, best way to bank your credentials and have transportability for licensure. So I think if Kansas wants to attract people that are graduating really in the last 10 years, most of them are doing CPQ.
Ditto.
That's really good to know. Like the fact that the graduates are taking this up and running with it, because you're right, if we want to attract people to work here in the state of Kansas, we've got to make it appetitive. And if this is something that makes it appetitive, then certainly we should consider doing something like this. And we all know that banking credentials, I mean, it has been a hassle over the course of the generations of psychologists. It's not easy to keep track of of what one has done, especially if programs close or internships close or postdocs close. Those things, they happen all of the time.
I have to do these attestations on a regular basis, and it's a real pain. I mean, it's very rigorous. So, you know, from my point of view, it's excellent. There's no reason not to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any insight into why Kansas is
seemingly at the end of the list of states to do this?
My perception, David, having been to the old educational roundtables that used to happen before COVID, is just because it was not a reciprocity state, they kind of viewed this similarly, but I don't want to speak for the board, David, but that was kind of my perception.
So I have a question. What's the difference between that and CAQH? Does anybody know?
My understanding, I don't know that I fully can answer that, but I thought that CAQH was connected to post licensure. So it includes your, like, depending on where you are, like a KMAP ID and all of those sorts of things. Whereas this is not necessarily only pre, but it starts in the beginning. Like a number of the interns who have come to us in the last 5 or 6 years are already doing this by the time they match with us. I'm not us anymore. Family service with match at family service. I've moved to Stormont, FYI. They would, when they came to match at family service, this was kind of like some universities make students track their hours on special programming. Some schools were using CPQ to start this process. On a personal note, as somebody who went to a university that no longer exists, this would have been beautiful when I was applying for SciPact. I made it, but it wasn't easy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe
My
that.
understanding is CAQH is not specific to psychology. So I think it's yet another body, but this is specific to psychology. Go ahead, Rodney.
Well, my understanding as well, because I don't know the other one. I know CAQH a lot better. And I don't think of it as a method of tracking education hours or anything of that nature or training. It's more for kind of a common platform for insurance companies to do with credentialing. And it keeps providers from having to fill out the common information over and over again every time that they would credential. Still, you still have to do some of that, but that's my understanding of the main purpose for CAQH.
Okay. Because I know I do CAQH and it says for credentialing and enrollment, but in order to be credentialed, I have to have my license, which means I have to have my continuing ed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I know I'm sorry. I know at CAQH, one of the things that you do have to list is updating your license credential as well as your malpractice insurance. And it does a very good job of telling you when you're about to date out on that stuff. So
right. Yeah. So I think somebody said that the CPQ is pre and CAQH is like post credential, right? So
well, you can do CPQ anytime. I wouldn't say that's the difference. I mean, it is maybe a difference, but it's not the difference. I mean, I think the CAQH is really just that it's lots of healthcare providers, and CPQ is specific to psychology.
Okay. So I've got to ask something. I'm going to express my stupidity here. I've never used CPQ, and I'm hearing what I think I hear is a method of tracking your education hours.
Yes.
Okay. If that's the case, they're not even the same. These are two different things that we're comparing.
Well, and you can track your education, you can track certificates, you can track licensure. It's a way to have mobility across states.
Oh no, I'm glad to hear this. This was not around, of course, when you and I went to graduate school.
We didn't have to have it, but I highly recommend it to all students.
Oh yeah,
licensing across states much easier, and most of them do it these days.
Yeah.
And I would agree with you that it's usually done. You can get a cheaper rate if you do it prior to internship, and then your rates go up as you get further out. So I encourage students to do it earlier because it's cheaper. And so it just makes life a little easier.
And so there's another central difference between CHQ and this method here. You don't have to pay for the insurance one. You have to, it sounds like you pay for this storage medium.
Well, and as far as I know, no one else can administer CPQ for you. Like it's yours, you do
Mhm.
it. And like CAQH, I don't touch that, like administrators where I've
Well,
worked have done that.
yeah, and if you're in private practice, you do.
Yeah.
That's the thing, is that if you work for an agency, they take care of that. Like when I started out,
Yeah.
Johnson County Mental Health created my account for me. I had no idea what this was until I left.
Right? Yes. So I don't think anybody can do that in CPQ,
Yeah.
as far as I can tell.
It sounds like there's, consensus that this is a good idea. There's a matter of, well, what is the next matter, David?
So this is an important step. I was really not familiar with APQ. It's been a helpful learning experience for me to hear some of your comments, and it does sound like there is positive comments and support. And based on how many other states and jurisdictions recognize this, including all 4 of our bordering states, definitely something that I can look into a little bit more. So how about this? How about if I reach out to ASPPB and see what it would take functionally for Kansas to be added to the list? And then I can bring that back to the December meeting with a little bit more concrete details as far as how this could be implemented in Kansas. And then if that sounds like something that would still be positive, at that time in December, the advisory committee could make a recommendation to the board to support that. And then that would be presented to the board, and in January, the board could consider taking it up.
All right. That sounds good. Any questions or thoughts about that? Anybody want to add anything? Seeing none, moving to number 9, and that's our new business, and the only item we have under new business is a discussion on time and format for meetings in 2024. So this meeting has been held on the second Tuesday of the month and every other month at 6 p.m. until 8 p.m. And we can make we can have a discussion about whether or not this time continues to work, if the 2-hour format continues to work, if the platform continues to work, having it via Zoom, if that continues to work. I would open it up to discussion about the timing of this meeting and other aspects of the meeting. Any thoughts or questions about going forward into 2024?
Personally, myself, I'm happy with the format on every other Tuesday. Being a private practice, it works really well for me because it's at the end of the day, and schedule-wise, it works really well. But that's from my own point of view. So I'm good with it. Like every other month, Tuesdays 6 to 8, if it's going to be done by Zoom.
I agree. I have no complaints.
I also agree. I think it's really great that we're able to use Zoom as a platform, because I think it makes it a lot easier and more time efficient for such a wide spread of board members throughout the state. So I'm good with the time, and I'm definitely good with the format.
Yes, we do have members that are spread across the state. So I think that this is a really good format for us to have this meeting in.
I will say I've appreciated us all on Zoom versus when some of us used to be in the boardroom and others called in. That was always so much trickier than with just all of us on Zoom together. We're all kind of in the same boat. I feel like that has been more productive.
Anyone else want to chime in, add their thoughts or concerns or anything? Well, it sounds like we can continue on with this format as well as the time and the dates. So that would put us with our next meeting being December 12th, and then David can send appointment, or excuse me, meeting requests out to all of us for 2024. I believe that would be the next step, correct, Dave?
Yes, I'll just go ahead and put out calendar appointments with the Zoom information for the meetings. And I'll try to send one general email to all of you as well, so that you have all 6 dates for the year. So that way, if you put them somewhere else, you can put those specific dates in your calendar. You know you'll be in these meetings at those times next year.
Wonderful. And that takes us to the end, unless there are any further points or questions. Seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn 6 minutes early.
I agree.
Mark moves. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Ronnie seconds. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And I don't think that there will be any opposed to that, so that carries. Everybody, please have a good rest of your Tuesday evening, and I will see you all in 2 months. Y'all take care.
Hey,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.